Lawyers. Should we use them? Should we avoid them? Let's get into it. G'day. Are you seeking to be a high-performance CEO or develop personal leadership and be a CEO in your own life? Then you've come to the right place, because we discuss real experiences from CEOs for you to learn from. And so you don't miss out, hit the like button, subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications. Let's get into it. G'day. Many times since I've been a CEO of my own company, I've been encouraged to use a lawyer, and I have resisted that because of the cost. The costs can be as high as $1,500 per hour for a New York high street lawyer, and I could employ an offshore developer to work full-time for a week on one of my projects for the same amount of money. So it's an enormous investment. And often it's presented to me that if I don't use a lawyer, there's significant business risks that I would be taking. Now, there are certainly times when you would need to use a lawyer, but there are many, many times when you don't have to and still mitigate those risks. So I'm going to show you some of the techniques that I use so that you don't always have to use a lawyer. Some years ago, I was presented with a document, and I was told that the document had been created by lawyers and it was worth $15,000. Naturally, I was curious, but also a little skeptical, given where I'm coming from with regards to using lawyers. So this document was many, many pages, and it was sent to me, and the implication was that I was getting something for free by having this document available to me. So how did I manage that? Well, first of all, I had a close look at the document, but there's a technique that I use for actually analyzing a document like this. There's a problem with legal documents, of course, because of the vocabulary and the long sentences and that particular language that lawyers use. But still, if you're a reasonably intelligent person, if you use this technique, it will help you unravel that. So the first thing you need to do is to take the document, and if it helps, print it out. It's not necessary to be printed, but if it helps, do so. And then just look at the overall structure of the document. Like, look at the headings, look at how many pages there are, and just get a feel for what this whole thing is in your head. You don't need to read it from start to finish. In fact, it really helps to scan and get a picture, a global picture of what it is you've been presented with. In this case, it was essentially a revenue sharing arrangement, agreement. Step two is to look at the key parts of that are of interest to you. So there might be a lot of preamble about who the companies are, where the jurisdiction is. You don't need to worry so much about that. Go to the key parts of the agreement. They might be just a couple of paragraphs that are talking about the specifics of, say, for example, this rev share. Read that in some detail and try to understand it. Now, the third part of that, within that, is to make sure that you understand the vocabulary. And it's really easy these days because we've got many tools available for us. Just type, the word into Google and you'll get the meaning, or better still, maybe upload the document to ChatGPT and get it to decode it for you. So make sure that there's no words in there that are confusing or ambiguous or not known to you, and you can do that easily. And then fourthly is to read the whole document in its entirety. So there's this 1, 2, 3, or 4 steps to understanding a legal document. Now, the second technique is to create what I call a heads of agreement. So take that contract and then on a clean sheet of paper, just write out what you believe to be the key elements of the agreement. So back to this rev share idea, one piece of the heads of the agreement might be that 10% of all revenues needs to go from company A to company B. That's a head of the agreement. Another one might be subscription fee, or some kind of fee is being paid from company A to company B. Whatever those heads of the agreement are, and usually you'll find you can put that down in half a dozen pieces or no more than one page if you're concise with exactly what needs to be done. It's enormously clarifying because it's now summarized the key elements that you are going to be negotiating on. Now, this brings in that point. Why do we have a contract, a legal contract? Well, it's a way of packaging up and formalizing an agreement. And an agreement comes out of negotiations. And how do you go about negotiations? Well, if you look at some of my previous videos, there's stuff on negotiations there that you can look at. But the heads of agreement gives you clarity about what you're negotiating and why you're negotiating and from what position you're negotiating from, without getting confused by all the legal jargon. Now, the third technique is to apply what I call business logic. And this is planning for certain scenarios. So I was recently presented with a legal contract which had an element of intellectual property in there, whereby if I was consulting to that company, they would own all of the intellectual property that was created during that term. Now, for most people, that may not be a concern. If you're strictly a consulting company, intellectual property can stay with the consumer, and that's okay. But in our case, we have a lot of intellectual property, particularly around AI vision and our Hawkeye product, which I needed to protect. And that clause said that any intellectual property created within that period would go to the client. That made me a little uncomfortable, but how do you sort of unravel that? Well, business logic can be applied and can be applied by way of example. So let's take an example where the company that I'm working for comes up with some idea and they want to patent it. Well, in that case, under this contract, it makes sense that that patent would be theirs and completely theirs. Very clear case. A second example might be my company comes up with the intellectual property and we want to patent it. In that case, it would be fair that it was our patent for us. But unfortunately, in this case, that clause would be a problem. And then the third case would be where there's some joint intellectual property created that could perhaps jointly be shared. And in this case, again, this clause is a problem because we can't share it. We have to give it all to the company. So by taking that clause and breaking it down using business logic and creating examples is a great way to really clarify what that means. And that's the third technique, breaking it down into business logic, creating cases and examples. So in what cases should you avoid using a lawyer? Well, certainly if you can't afford a lawyer, then you have no choice but to do it yourself. And that being the case in small companies that I've run that can't afford an expensive lawyer, in that case, you kind of have to do it yourself. Well, number one is cost. Lawyers are expensive and you can run up to many, many thousands of dollars just simply by having a document reviewed by them. I'm not saying they wouldn't do a great job, but if you can't afford it and you still need to move forward, then you need to do this work yourself and use some of those techniques that I illuminated earlier. So how do you decide when to use a lawyer and when not to? Well, before we get to that decision, let's understand and analyze how a lawyer works, how they are motivated. Like all businesses, they exist to generate revenues. One technique they apply is to create issues and risks and problems that you may or may not have been aware of, and using their skills, they propose to solve those problems. And that can be great and can be very helpful, or it can be superfluous or excess to what you need. And really that is where the decision lies. It lies in whether you feel you can manage risks and issues yourself around this context, or you need extra support from a lawyer. Now, when might a lawyer actually undermine your business? And they don't do it intentionally, but in some cases, using that technique of creating issues and problems can actually slow down your business. In a recent example, I was working with a client and they wanted to use a lawyer. And in that case, they decided to use this lawyer and include them in some of the material that I had sent them. This was detailed technical material around software development, and it was clear to us, because we were copied into the communications, that the lawyer was not on our side. He was calling some of our legal jargon gobbledygook and definitely not helping us come to an agreement. He had in fact taken up a position perhaps to protect the client, but also perhaps to create a problem and an issue that he felt would put him in a stronger position. Lawyers can really get in the way of good communication and good negotiations. I believe, as I've put in other videos, that it's important to signal and to be open and honest about negotiations. And sometimes lawyers will have an agenda or take up a position which can undermine negotiations. When are situations when it would make sense to use a lawyer? Well, if your opposite party or the company you're negotiating with wants to bring a lawyer in, then it might make sense to bring a lawyer in as well, because you will have more clout on your side of the negotiation. It does, in my opinion, not create the best, smoothest negotiation. It may drag out things, but if you feel that you can't get around them having a lawyer, then you may have to bring your lawyer in. Another case much simpler case where you might want a lawyer is when you want to create a letter of demand, or you want to send a letter to a company that is perhaps outstanding on an invoice and you need a little bit more clout behind your request for payment. Then it might be a good idea to get a lawyer to write up a letter for you. And then the third case is where you feel you are really out of your depth, that the problems, issues and risks that are coming up are beyond what you feel you can manage on your own or with your own executive or management team. In that case, you might want to bring a lawyer in and have them as part of the negotiations to help you with your detailed negotiations. Using a lawyer can be a little bit like having a gun. It's great when it's in your hand and you have complete control over it, and it's a very powerful tool for you to get what you want. But it could also be used against you if you lose control of that very powerful weapon. So I encourage all of my CEOs and people that I work with, use lawyers sparingly. Do as much as you can on your own. Understand the details of a negotiation and the contract. And then if you feel you're out of your depth and you absolutely need a lawyer, then certainly use them. Be aware of the costs, be aware of the need to manage and deal with them and to understand the gravity of the risks and problems that they're presenting to you. And in summary, be involved, do the work that's required to understand your negotiation. It's your future, it's your negotiation, you lead the negotiation. I hope that helps, and thanks for watching.